The Apache woman closed her eyes to die, but woke bare on my bed. The morning sun rose slowly over the vast desert, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold. The air was still, carrying only the faint scent of dry earth and sage. In a small, humble village at the edge of the desert, an Apache woman named Nayeli opened her eyes to the quiet world around her. She was known in her village for her quiet strength and gentle heart, yet the weight of recent hardships pressed heavily on her. Life had not been easy, and every day felt like a test of endurance. Nayeli lived in a simple wooden house at the outskirts of the village. Breaths. Its walls were worn by years of sun, wind, and storms, but it had a warmth that came from the care she had given it. Inside, the house smelled faintly of herbs and clay, and small bundles of dried plants hung from the ceiling. These were for healing and for cooking, for she had learned from her mother the ways of the land and the gifts it could provide. Despite the simplicity of her life, Nayeli had always found joy in small things. The laughter of children playing outside, the songs of birds at dawn, the gentle sway of the desert grass in the wind. But that morning, as Nayeli sat on the edge of her bed, she felt a heaviness in her chest that made breathing seem like a labor. The past few months had been harsh. A long drought had left the crops weak, and food was scarce. Her father had fallen ill, and the responsibility of caring for him had fallen squarely on her shoulders. Each day she walked miles to fetch water from the distant river, balancing clay pots carefully on her hips. Each day she prepared what little food they could find and tended to the small garden that stubbornly refused to flourish. Her hands were calloused, and her body ached, but she endured silently. On that particular morning, Nayeli's heart felt heavier than usual. The sickness in her father had worsened, and the village healer was away in a neighboring town, leaving her to rely on the herbs she remembered from childhood. She closed her eyes, imagining the gentle hands of her mother guiding her, but the memory brought only bittersweet tears. The village had been her home all her life, yet it now felt as though the world itself was testing her limits. She wondered how much longer she could hold on. Pictere. Despite the despair, Nayeli was not alone. The village children often ran past her house, laughing and calling to one another, unaware of the quiet struggles happening inside. Nayeli would sometimes sit by the window and watch them, allowing herself a small smile. Their innocence reminded her that life was still moving forward, that even in the harshest times there were moments of light. Pray. She would whisper small prayers for their health, for the rain to come, and for strength to keep going. The day moved slowly. Nayeli rose from her bed and went to the small kitchen area. The morning light spilled across the floor, casting long shadows. She prepared a simple meal of cornmeal and water, trying to coax some energy into her weak body. Every movement felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of the world rested upon her shoulders. She paused by the window, staring at the horizon, wishing for a sign of hope, a glimpse of relief from her worries. The desert seemed endless, stretching into the distance with no promise of change, yet she knew that somewhere beyond it, life continued. As she tended to her father, Nayeli reflected on her childhood. She remembered her mother telling stories of their ancestors, of Apache warriors and wise women who faced great challenges and never gave up. Those stories had always inspired her, filling her with a sense of pride and determination. Now, as she carried the responsibilities that had once been shared by her family, those lessons took on new meaning. She realized that strength was not about never falling, but about rising again each time life pushed her down. Hours passed slowly and the heat of the day grew stronger. Nayeli worked tirelessly, mending clothes, fetching water, and preparing food. Each task, though small, felt monumental in the absence of support. Her father slept most of the day, his breathing shallow, and she sat beside him, holding his hand and speaking softly. Sometimes he would murmur words she could barely understand, and she would nod, offering what comfort she could. In those moments she felt both the burden and the honor of care, the deep connection between parent and child, and the fragility of life. As evening approached, a soft wind stirred the dust outside. Naeli stepped outside for a brief moment, feeling the coolness against her face. She gazed at the sky, which had turned a deep orange, and then to the distant mountains, their peaks shrouded in haze. She thought about the future, uncertain, fragile, and yet still full of possibility. Breaths she had learned to face each day with quiet courage, drawing strength from the land, from her memories, and from the small joys that still existed. That night, after her father had settled into bed, Naeli returned to her own. She sat quietly, listening to the sounds of the village settling into rest. The laughter of children had faded, and the wind whispered through the trees. She felt the weight of exhaustion pressing upon her, yet there was also a flicker of resilience. She closed her eyes and allowed herself a moment of rest, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of challenges. But for now, she simply breathed, grounding herself in the knowledge that she had endured every hardship so far, and she would endure the next.
In the quiet of her room, Naeli reflected on the lessons she had learned. Life was unpredictable and often harsh, yet it was also filled with moments of beauty and kindness.
Even in despair, hope could take root. She thought about her community, the people who might be struggling just as she was, and the bonds that connected them all. She realized that strength was not just physical but emotional, spiritual, and tied to the care one gave and received. As the night deepened, Naeli drifted into a light sleep, her body weary but her spirit quietly defiant. She dreamed of a future where the drought would end, where her father would regain his health, and where her small acts of care would ripple outward to touch others. In her dreams, she walked through fields of green, the sun warming her face, and felt the deep satisfaction of having survived and persevered. The first part of Naeli's story is one of quiet endurance and inner strength. It is a story that reminds us that even in the face of overwhelming hardship, the human spirit has a remarkable capacity to hold on, to care, and to hope. Naeli's life is not extraordinary in the sense of grand adventure, but it is extraordinary in the depth of courage, resilience, and love that it contains. In these first moments, the audience begins to understand the world she inhabits, the struggles she faces, and the strength she carries within her. Part 1 ends with Naeli resting in the stillness of the night, exhausted but resolute. The stage is set for the challenges ahead, the moments of crisis that will test her resolve, and the experiences that will shape her journey. The audience is left with a sense of connection to her humanity, a desire to see how she will overcome the obstacles before her, and an appreciation for the quiet heroism of ordinary life. The morning arrived slowly, with pale sunlight filtering through the cracks in the wooden walls of Naeli's small home. The desert had a quiet rhythm, and each sound, whether the soft cry of a bird or the rustle of dry grass, seemed louder against the stillness. Naeli awoke with a lingering ache in her muscles, the heaviness of yesterday still pressing on her body and spirit. But yet, she knew that rest was brief. The world outside demanded action, and she had responsibilities that could not wait. Her father had not slept well through the night. His breathing was shallow, and his fever had risen slightly, leaving Naeli anxious. She moved carefully to his side, checking his pulse and making sure the small cloth dampened with cool water touched his skin.
She whispered soothing words, hoping they would ease his discomfort.
Though the village healer was away, Naeli remembered her mother's lessons, blending herbs and roots to make teas and poultices. Every movement felt precise yet slow, as though the slightest mistake could cause more harm than good. After tending to her father, Naeli stepped outside to gather water from the distant well. The sun had climbed higher, and the desert already radiated heat. Each step felt heavier than the last, but Naeli's resolve kept her moving forward. Along the way, she passed fields that had suffered in the drought. Cornstalks drooped, and the soil cracked under the sun. Even the cacti seemed to struggle against the relentless dry wind. Yet Naeli refused to give in to despair. She knelt by the parched earth, brushing her fingers over the cracked soil, silently promising that she would not abandon her efforts, no matter how difficult the day became. The journey to the well was long, and Naeli carried the clay pots carefully on her hips. The weight pressed into her shoulders, yet she moved steadily, step by step. Along the path, she met others from the village who were also collecting water. Some offered her a small nod or a word of encouragement, and she returned the gesture with a quiet smile. Even in hardship, the sense of community lingered, reminding her that she was not alone. Each person carried their own struggles, yet together they found small moments of shared strength. When Naeli returned home with the water, she immediately tended to her father again. She prepared a weak tea from herbs, hoping it would bring him some relief. She spoke softly to him, recounting stories from the village, tales of courage and survival that her mother had shared with her. Though he was too weak to respond fully, she could see the faint flicker of recognition in his eyes, and that gave her a small measure of comfort. Caring for him was exhausting, but Naeli drew strength from the thought that her efforts made a difference, however small it might seem. By mid-morning the sun was high and the heat pressed relentlessly against the small house. Naeli stepped outside briefly, carrying a few items of laundry to dry on a line stretched between two wooden posts. The fabric moved gently in the wind, and for a moment she allowed herself a small pause, inhaling the desert air. It was a rare moment of peace, and she held it close, knowing that such moments were fleeting in a life filled with duty and challenge. She thought of her mother and the stories of perseverance she had heard as a child. Naeli realized that every small act she performed, watering the garden, preparing food, cleaning the house, was a way of honoring those lessons, a way of keeping hope alive. Suddenly, a commotion arose near the edge of the village. Naeli looked toward the source and saw a group of travelers arriving, their horses kicking up dust as they approached. The village had not seen many visitors in recent months, and curiosity drew Naeli closer. As she watched, she recognized one of the travelers as an elder from a neighboring village. He called out greetings, and the villagers began to gather, some bringing food and water to share.
Naeli felt a stir of hope. Perhaps help had come, or at least new information that could ease some of the burdens she carried alone.
The elder explained that the drought had affected many villages across the region. He brought news of other families struggling, crops failing, and communities working together to survive. There was talk of shared resources, temporary relief, and collective efforts to make the harsh conditions more bearable. Naeli listened intently, absorbing every word. While it did not solve her immediate problems, it reminded her that even in the worst times, there was support to be found if people reached out and worked together. The afternoon brought new challenges. Naeli noticed that her father's fever had increased, and despite her careful tending, he seemed weaker than before. Panic threatened to take hold, but she steadied herself with deep breaths. Perhaps. She recalled the remedies her mother had taught her, specific combinations of herbs to reduce fever, ways to keep the body hydrated, and gentle techniques to ease discomfort. She worked carefully, boiling water, preparing herbal teas, and ensuring her father remained as comfortable as possible. The effort required every ounce of her energy, but Naeli refused to yield to despair. She repeated silent prayers for his recovery, asking for guidance and strength to see him through the day. As evening approached, the village settled into a quiet rhythm. Children returned from the edges of the desert where they had played, their laughter ringing through the cool air. Naeli prepared a simple meal, sharing what little food they had. Berating, she sat beside her father, encouraging him to eat and drink, even if only a few sips or bites were possible. The connection between them was profound, filled with unspoken love, care, and the unyielding determination to survive together. Night fell, and the desert became a canvas of stars. Naeli stayed awake long after her father had fallen into a light sleep, sitting beside him and reflecting on the day. She thought about the travelers' words, the news of the neighboring villages, and the possibility of aid arriving in the coming weeks. She realized that survival was not about facing hardship alone, but about finding ways to connect, share, and support one another. Even the smallest acts of kindness, whether from strangers or neighbors, could bring hope and sustain life. The night was quiet, except for the soft whisper of the wind through the desert grass.
Nayeli allowed herself a brief moment of reflection.
She remembered her childhood walks through the desert with her mother, learning the names of plants, the paths of animals, and the hidden wells that provided water in dry times. Those lessons were not just about survival. They were about resilience, observation, and understanding the rhythms of life.
Nayeli drew on those memories now, letting them guide her actions and calm her fears.
As the night deepened, Nayeli knew that tomorrow would bring more work, more worry, and perhaps more challenges. Yet there was a subtle shift within her, a growing understanding that endurance was not a solitary effort. The travelers, the village, and even the faint flicker of life in her father offered proof that life could continue, that hardship could be faced, and that hope could be nurtured even in the harshest conditions. In these quiet hours, Nayeli made a silent promise to herself. She would continue to care for her father, nurture the small garden, and seek ways to connect with others who might need help. She realized that her strength came not from avoiding struggle, but from facing it head-on, from rising each day despite exhaustion, fear, and uncertainty. In the stillness of the desert night, Nayeli found a renewed sense of purpose, a quiet but unshakable determination that would carry her through the days ahead.
Part 2 of Nayeli's story shows her resilience in the face of mounting challenges.
It highlights the weight of responsibility, the effort required to care for a loved one, and the importance of community and connection. The audience begins to see how her inner strength and determination are tested, and how moments of hope, no matter how small, can provide the fuel to keep going. The story continues to build, setting the stage for even greater challenges and turning points in her journey. By the end of Part 2, Nayeli has survived another day of physical and emotional strain, learned that help can come from unexpected places, and strengthen her resolve. The audience is left eager to see what comes next, how she will face the challenges ahead, and whether her efforts will be enough to overcome the hardships that life continues to place in her path. The next morning dawned bright and unforgiving between. The sun rose high above the desert, casting long, sharp shadows across the cracked earth. Nayeli awoke with a sense of unease, a weight in her chest that she could not shake. Her father's fever had worsened overnight, and despite her careful tending, he seemed weaker than ever. His breaths were shallow, and each movement he made required an effort that made Nayeli's heart ache, for she knew that she could not face this alone. The village healer was still away, and time was slipping through her fingers like grains of sand. With a determined resolve, Nayeli prepared a strong herbal tea for her father, carefully mixing the roots and leaves she remembered from her mother's teachings. She whispered words of encouragement, stroking his hair and holding his hand. But yet even as she worked, fear gnawed at her mind. What if her efforts were not enough? What if the illness took him before help could arrive? She had never felt such a sense of helplessness before, and it frightened her. The morning passed slowly. Nayeli moved from task to task, tending to her father, checking on the garden, and trying to maintain some order in the small house. Outside, the desert seemed harsher than usual, the wind carrying a dry, dusty heat that made every breath heavy. She glanced at the horizon, wondering if the clouds would gather and bring rain, but the sky remained clear and mercilessly bright. The village seemed quiet, almost eerily still, as if the world itself was holding its breath along with her. By midday, Nayeli realized that her father's condition was not improving. Panic began to rise inside her, but she forced herself to stay calm.
She remembered a small story her mother had told her about a woman who had faced a seemingly impossible challenge, yet found a way to survive. Nayeli clung to that memory, drawing strength from the example of resilience it provided.
She knew she had to act quickly if her father was to recover.
Deciding to leave the house, Nayeli set out to find water from a nearby spring she had once visited with her mother.
The journey was difficult, and the sun beat down relentlessly on her back. Her steps grew slower, and the weight of the clay pots made her shoulders ache, but she pressed on. Along the path she noticed the tracks of animals, signs of life that reminded her that survival was a constant struggle for all living beings in the desert. She paused to study them, thinking about the lessons nature offered, about perseverance and adaptability. When she reached the spring, Nayeli found that the water level was lower than she remembered. The drought had affected even this hidden source. She knelt carefully by the edge, dipping the pots into the cool water and filling them as best she could. Her hands trembled slightly from exhaustion and worry, but she did not allow herself to stop. Every drop of water she carried back would make a difference for her father, and that thought fueled her determination. As she returned to the village, a sudden commotion caught her attention. Smoke rose from the far edge of the settlement, and voices shouted warnings. Nayeli ran toward the noise, her heart pounding. She saw that a small fire had started near a storage shed where some of the village's supplies were kept. Flames licked at the wooden walls, and the dry wind threatened to spread the fire further. Panic swept through the villagers as they tried to contain it, throwing sand and water on the flames. Nayeli did not hesitate. She joined them, carrying water from her pots and helping to beat down the flames. The effort was exhausting, but the village managed to control the fire before it spread to the homes. Nayeli, covered in soot and sweat, stood trembling, her heart still racing from the ordeal. The fire had been a frightening reminder of how fragile life could be, how quickly circumstances could change. Yet, even in that moment of chaos, she felt a sense of pride. Together with her neighbors, she had faced a dangerous situation and had prevented it from becoming a disaster. The experience reminded her that strength was not just about facing personal struggles, but also about coming together with others to protect and support one another. Returning home, Nayeli found her father's condition had worsened further. His breathing was uneven, and his skin felt hot to the touch. Brave clawed at her chest, but she steeled herself. She prepared a stronger herbal mixture, carefully following the instructions she remembered from her mother's teachings. She sat beside him holding his hand and whispered stories of courage and survival, hoping that her voice could bring him comfort even if her remedies were not enough. Hours passed, and the heat of the day gave way to a cooler, softer evening. Nayeli noticed that the village healer was finally returning, riding a tired horse with a small bundle of herbs and supplies. Relief flooded through her, and she rushed to meet him, explaining her father's worsening condition. The healer examined her father carefully, nodding with approval at Nayeli's careful tending, but he warned that her father was at a critical stage and required constant attention. Breath. Nayeli listened intently, absorbing every instruction, determined to follow them to the letter. The night fell with a quiet intensity. Nayeli stayed awake beside her father, monitoring his temperature and administering the herbal remedies as the healer had instructed. Her body was exhausted, her muscles aching, but she refused to leave his side. Every small movement, every careful action was a testament to her love and determination. She whispered encouragements, reminded him of the beauty of the world outside, and held his hand, hoping her presence alone could provide some comfort.
As midnight approached, the desert outside her window was bathed in silver moonlight. Nayeli's mind wandered to memories of her mother and the stories of strength and perseverance she had learned as a child.
But, she thought about the ancestors who had survived hardships far greater than hers, who had walked through challenges and emerged stronger. Those stories no longer felt like distant tales. They were guides for the present, beacons of hope that she clung to desperately. The night stretched on, and Nayeli continued her vigil. Her father's condition slowly began to stabilize under her careful care and the healer's guidance. Relief washed over her, mingled with exhaustion and a quiet sense of triumph. She realized that even in moments of crisis, human resilience could prevail, and that courage was often found in the small, unrelenting acts of care that kept life going. By the early hours of morning, Naili finally allowed herself a brief rest, leaning against the wall beside her father's bed. The fire of the previous day and the stress of the illness had left her drained, but she felt a subtle shift within her, a growing confidence in her ability to face challenges, to endure hardship, and to act decisively when circumstances demanded it. She knew that more challenges would come, but she had faced one of the greatest trials yet and emerged stronger. Part 3 of Naeli's story marks a turning point. She faces both personal and external crises, her father's worsening illness, and the fire in the village. These events test her courage, endurance, and ability to act under pressure. The audience sees her strength not only in her care for her father, but also in her contribution to the community, showing that heroism often comes in quiet, determined acts rather than grand gestures. By the end of Part 3, Naeli is exhausted but resilient, having learned that courage is built in moments of crisis, that hope can survive even in dire circumstances, and that the support of a community can be just as crucial as personal determination. The story leaves the audience eager to see what comes next, how Naeli will continue to face challenges, and whether she can secure a lasting path of stability and recovery for herself and her father. The desert morning came quietly, though the air was heavy with anticipation. Naeli had spent much of the night beside her father, monitoring his breathing and keeping his temperature steady. The healer had left some instructions, but the responsibility now rested almost entirely on her shoulders. The house felt unusually still, and Naeli could sense that the next hours would be crucial. Her heart carried both worry and determination, worry for her father's health, and determination to do everything possible to keep him alive.
As she moved through the small house tending to the few daily chores, Naeli reflected on the journey so far.
The drought had made life difficult for everyone, but her father's illness had transformed those difficulties into an urgent struggle for survival. She realized that her own endurance was being tested, that she was learning the limits of patience, strength, and courage. Her task, no matter how small, had become monumental, yet Naeli faced them with quiet resolve, refusing to give in to despair. By mid-morning, a new challenge appeared, picked up, carrying dust and sand across the village. The small garden Naeli had worked so hard to maintain was threatened. The fragile plants bent under the wind, and she feared they might break or die. Grasp. She grabbed a piece of cloth and carefully covered them, tying it down with thin ropes to protect them from the harsh gusts. Her hands were scraped and bleeding slightly from the effort, but she ignored the pain. Each plant represented hope, a symbol that even in harsh conditions, life could endure with care and attention. Meanwhile, her father's condition remained fragile. His fever fluctuated, and his breathing became more uneven as the day progressed. Naeli felt a deep ache in her chest each time he groaned in discomfort, but she did not allow herself to show fear. Instead, she worked methodically, preparing herbal teas and gently massaging his limbs to ease his pain. She spoke softly, recounting tales of the desert, the mountains, and the people who had lived and survived in this harsh land. Her voice became a lifeline, a gentle thread connecting him to the world outside his illness.
The villagers began to notice her tireless dedication.
Brought small offerings of food or clean water, while others offered words of encouragement.
Naeli accepted them with gratitude, but did not stop her work to rest or eat.
Her focus was on survival, on keeping her father alive, and on finding strength within herself that she had never needed so urgently before. With each hour, the responsibility she carried grew heavier, yet so did her resolve. She realized that true courage was not about daring feats or heroic acts in public. It was about quiet perseverance, about showing up for those who depended on you, even when every part of you longed to rest. As afternoon approached, the wind shifted, bringing a dry, hot current that made breathing more difficult. Nayeli's small house, already warm from the desert sun, became almost unbearable. Her body ached. An exhaustion weighed on her like a heavy stone. Yet she pressed on. She drank sparingly from the water she had collected, knowing she needed her strength to continue caring for her father. Each sip reminded her that survival required both patience and sacrifice. Suddenly, her father stirred violently, his body shaking from the fever. Nayeli rushed to him, holding him firmly but gently, whispering soothing words. Panic surged in her heart, but she controlled her voice and focused on the tasks she had learned from her mother and the healer. She applied cool compresses, adjusted his position, and monitored his breathing carefully. Hours seemed to stretch into an eternity as she worked, never leaving his side, never allowing herself even a moment of distraction. Every movement, every gesture was deliberate, an act of love and courage intertwined.
In the late afternoon, Nayeli felt a moment of despair creeping in.
The weight of the past days, the fire, the drought, the constant care of her father, threatened to overwhelm her. She felt tears prick her eyes, but held them back. Sitting beside her father, she took deep breaths and reminded herself that giving in to despair would not help him, would not help herself, and would not help the small garden, the village, or the fragile threads of hope she had been nurturing. She closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the stories her mother had told her as a child, tales of survival, resilience, and strength in the face of impossible odds. By evening, Nayeli realized that her efforts were starting to have an effect. Her father's fever had slightly reduced, and his breathing was less labored. Though still weak, he was no longer in immediate danger. Relief washed over Nayeli, mingled with exhaustion and a quiet pride. She had faced one of the greatest challenges of her life, relying on every ounce of strength, knowledge, and courage she possessed. She realized that true resilience was a combination of persistence, adaptability, and hope, all guided by love and care for others. As the night deepened, the desert outside glimmered under a blanket of stars. Inspiration. Nayeli sat beside her father, holding his hand and listening to the quiet sounds of the night. The distant cry of an owl, the whisper of the wind, the faint shuffle of small creatures in the sand. In those quiet hours, she allowed herself to reflect on the journey so far. She had faced fear, exhaustion, and despair, yet she had not broken. Instead, she had grown stronger, more aware of her capacity to endure, and more connected to the world around her. Part 4 also brought a realization of emotional strength. Nayeli understood that survival was not just physical, it was emotional and spiritual. Her care, patience, and dedication were not only keeping her father alive, but also shaping her into a person capable of facing any challenge. She recognized that the desert, the drought, and the hardships of life were not enemies to be defeated, but teachers, offering lessons in resilience, patience, and the value of small, persistent efforts. By the early hours of the following morning, Nayeli's father was resting more comfortably, and she allowed herself a brief moment of sleep. Her dreams were filled with images of green fields, flowing water, and warm sunlight, visions that contrasted with the harsh desert reality but reflected the hope she carried within her. She knew that the future was still uncertain, but for the first time in days, she felt a quiet sense of confidence that they could face whatever challenges lay ahead.
Part 4 of Nayeli's story is a climactic emotional point.
She faces the peak of her struggle, balancing exhaustion, fear, and responsibility, and emerges with a deeper understanding of her own strength. The audience witnesses her courage, her perseverance, and the emotional growth that comes from facing life's most difficult moments. The story emphasizes the quiet heroism of daily acts of care, the power of hope, and the resilience of the human spirit.
By the end of Part 4, Nayeli has endured the height of her challenges.
She has faced fear, uncertainty, and exhaustion, and yet she remains steadfast. Her father's gradual recovery offers hope, and the lessons she has learned prepare her for the final part of the story. The audience is left eager to see how she will consolidate her experiences, overcome the remaining obstacles, and find resolution, both for herself and for the people she cares for. The morning came with a gentle light, softening the harsh outlines of the desert. Nayeli awoke slowly, feeling the ache of the past days in her muscles, but also a quiet sense of accomplishment. Her father was resting peacefully beside her, his breathing steady and calm for the first time in many weeks. Relief filled her chest, mingled with a lingering exhaustion, but it was a different kind of tiredness now, a satisfaction born of endurance, care, and perseverance.
Nayeli rose quietly and stepped outside.
The village was alive with movement, people tending to daily tasks, and the children's laughter floated across the open spaces. Psh! She watched them for a moment, thinking about how fragile and precious life could be, how quickly circumstances could change, and how much courage it took to face each day. Her own journey over the past days had been a testament to that courage, a combination of love, patience, and sheer determination. The drought was still present, and the desert remained unforgiving, but a subtle sense of hope lingered in the air. The villagers had begun to rebuild and reorganize, sharing resources and helping one another to recover from the recent fire and ongoing hardships. Nayeli had played her part in this effort, offering help whenever she could despite her exhaustion. She realized that survival was never just about oneself. It was about connection, community, and shared responsibility. The experiences of the past days had taught her that strength multiplied when people worked together and supported one another. Her father stirred, opening his eyes slowly. A faint smile touched his lips as he saw Nayeli sitting beside him, frowned, and squeezed it gently, relief and love shining in her eyes. Words were not necessary. The bond between them was clear in the simple act of holding hands. His health had improved significantly, though he was still weak, and Nayeli knew that continued care would be necessary. But for the first time, the shadow of fear that had loomed over her for so long seemed to lift, replaced by a quiet optimism. Throughout the day, Nayeli worked alongside the villagers, helping to repair homes, secure the garden, and carry water to those in need. Every action reminded her that she was no longer facing her struggles alone. The small acts of kindness from neighbors and travelers had strengthened the community, and in turn, strengthened her. Realized that hope was not a distant concept, but something nurtured through effort, care, and connection.
Each contribution, no matter how small, created a ripple that improved not only her life but the lives of others around her.
In the afternoon, Nayeli walked to the edge of the village and looked out at the desert. The sun painted the sand and rocks in shades of gold and orange, and a gentle breeze carried the faint scent of sage. She reflected on everything that had happened, the fear, the exhaustion, the small victories, and the moments of despair. Every challenge she had faced had taught her something about herself, her resilience, her patience, her ability to endure and adapt. Desk! She understood now that courage was not always loud or dramatic. It often lived in quiet, consistent effort, in facing hardship day by day with hope and determination. Her thoughts turned to the future. While the drought might continue, and while life would never be entirely free of challenges, Nayeli felt prepared in a way she had never been before. She had learned to observe, to act carefully, to balance her own needs with the needs of those she cared for. For Avens, she had discovered a strength she had not known existed within her, a resilience that would carry her through the difficulties to come. The desert, once a place of fear and uncertainty, now seemed to reflect her own inner strength, a harsh but beautiful teacher that shaped those who endured its trials. Evening came quietly. Nayeli returned home, her father resting comfortably in his bed. She prepared a small meal for them both, savoring the simple act of cooking and sharing food. The ordinary moments of life, which had seemed so fragile during the height of the crisis, now felt profound. She sat beside her father, speaking softly. telling him stories of the past and of her hopes for the future. The house, once a place of quiet struggle, now radiated warmth and safety. It was a small sanctuary amid the vastness of the desert, a space where love, care, and hope had proven stronger than fear and despair. Bah! Later that night, Nayeli stepped outside once more. The sky was filled with stars, brighter than she had ever noticed before, each one a distant reminder of the vastness of the world. She thought about the journey she had traveled, from the days of uncertainty and exhaustion to this moment of quiet triumph. She realized that life's value was not measured solely by comfort or ease, but by the ability to endure, to care for others, and to continue moving forward even when circumstances were harsh. The challenges she had faced had shaped her, but they had not defeated her. Past. As she gazed at the stars, Nayeli made a promise to herself. She would continue to care for her father, to nurture her small garden, and to support her community whenever possible. She would remember the lessons of resilience, hope, and quiet courage that had carried her through the most difficult days. And she would hold on to the knowledge that even in the harshest conditions, life could thrive with patience, love, and dedication. The night deepened, and Nayeli finally allowed herself to rest. Her body ached, but her spirit was lighter than it had been in weeks. She slept with a sense of calm, knowing that she had done everything within her power to protect and support those she loved. The desert, once a place of struggle and uncertainty, now felt like a partner in her journey, reflecting the strength she had cultivated within herself. Part 5 of Nayeli's story brings resolution and reflection. She has survived the peak of her struggle, faced her greatest fears, and emerged stronger and wiser. Her father's recovery symbolizes the success of her perseverance, while the support of her community highlights the importance of connection and shared resilience. The story emphasizes that courage is often quiet, endurance is often tested in small daily actions, and hope is nurtured through care, persistence, and love. By the end of the story, Nayeli has grown in ways she could not have imagined at the beginning. She has discovered her inner strength, learned the value of patience and care, and recognized the importance of community and support. The audience is left with a sense of satisfaction, inspired by her resilience and the lessons she has learned. The story closes on a note of hope, showing that even in the harshest conditions, the human spirit can endure and thrive.
In the final hours, Nayeli sat beside her father, holding his hand and gazing out at the desert.
The wind was calm, the stars bright, and for the first time in weeks she felt a deep sense of peace. The struggles were not over, and life would always bring new challenges, but she had discovered a quiet courage within herself that would guide her through whatever came next. She understood that every day was an opportunity to endure, to care, and to grow. And she embraced that understanding with gratitude and hope. The story of Nayeli, the Apache woman who faced hardship, illness, and the harshness of the desert, concludes with a testament to resilience, love, and perseverance. Her journey shows that even ordinary lives, when faced with extraordinary challenges, can demonstrate courage, hope, and the quiet heroism of enduring and caring.
The lessons she has learned are universal. Strength is nurtured through action, hope is sustained through patience, and the bonds we share with others can transform the most difficult circumstances into opportunities for growth and connection.